woods don't forget, child. They listen, they watch, and if you're unlucky, they'll remember you. Ah, summer camps, a place for laughter, friendship, and late-night ghost stories told by the fire. But you've heard me talk about stories before, haven't you? Not all of them are make-believe. Some stories cling to places like fog to a lake. No matter how much you try to forget, they seep back in. Take Camp Hollow Creek, for instance. Forgotten now, swallowed whole by the forest. But it wasn't always like that. It used to be filled with kids every summer, running, shouting, living like they had no idea something older was watching them. This story, though, it's about the summer the camp closed for good. There were 12 campers that summer, but 4 of them are the ones you'll want to remember. Amara, sharp-minded and steady, always ready to lead when no one else would. Elias, the jokester with a laugh too loud and too frequent, as if he were trying to drown something out. Gideon, quiet but sharp-eyed, always noticing what others didn't. Evangeline, soft-spoken, the girl who swore she could feel things before they happened. They were just kids, but the woods, oh, the woods have never cared about age. The woods don't forget, child. They listen, they watch. And if you're unlucky, they'll remember you. Ah, summer camps, a place for laughter, friendship, and late-night ghost stories told by the fire. But you've heard me talk about stories before, haven't you? Not all of them are make-believe. Some stories cling to places like fog to a lake. No matter how much you try to forget, they seep back in. Take Camp Hollow Creek, for instance. Forgotten now, swallowed whole by the forest. But it wasn't always like that. It used to be filled with kids every summer, running, shouting, living like they had no idea something older was watching them. This story, though, it's about the summer the camp closed for good. There were 12 campers that summer, but 4 of them are the ones you'll want to remember. Amara, sharp-minded and steady, always ready to lead when no one else would. Elias, the jokester with a laugh too loud and too frequent, as if he were trying to drown something out. Gideon, quiet but sharp-eyed, always noticing what others didn't. Evangeline, soft-spoken, the girl who swore she could feel things before they happened. They were just kids, but the woods have never cared about age. The bus ride was long. The road to Hollow Creek was a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt, flanked on both sides by dense woods that seemed to breathe in unison. For hours, the only sound was the low hum of the bus engine and the occasional snoring of one of the campers. Amara sat by the window, eyes scanning the trees as they passed. Every now and then, she'd think she saw something shift in the shadows, but it was always gone before she could focus on it. It was just the woods, she told herself, just trees swaying in the wind. Elias was sprawled across his seat, his headphones on, tapping his foot to a rhythm only he could hear. He tossed a crumpled piece of paper at Gideon, who was sitting ahead of him. It bounced off Gideon's shoulder, but Gideon didn't react. He just glanced at Elias and turned his gaze back to the window, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. Evangeline sat by herself near the back of the bus, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her lips moved every so often, but no sound came out. She did this often, mumbling little nothings that no one could hear. People thought she was strange. She didn't mind. The driver finally spoke as the camp entrance came into view. "All right, kids," he said, his voice gruff from years of smoking. "Camp Hollow Creek. Last stop." The gate was old and rusted, hanging from its hinges. The sign, once bright with red and yellow paint, had faded to gray. The word hollow was still legible, but creek was half covered in creeping vines. The bus rumbled to a stop, and Miss Eliza, the camp director, was already waiting. She stood with her hands on her hips, eyes scanning the campers as they stepped off. Her face was lined with years of stress and sunburn, and her eyes, well, her eyes had seen too much. "Welcome to Hollow Creek," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's going to be a summer you won't forget." They settled into their cabins as the sun began to set. Cabins 1 through 4 were for the boys, and 5 through 8 were for the girls. Amara shared her cabin with Evangeline, along with 2 other campers, Ruby and Dahlia. It wasn't long before the whispering started. Evangeline lay on her bunk, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "You hear it, don't you?" she said quietly. Amara rolled over. "Hear what?" Evangeline sat up slowly, her head tilting toward the wall. Her eyes were wide, pupils like pinpricks. "Scratching," she said. "It's been doing it since we got here." "Evangeline, it's an old cabin. It's just mice," Amara said, trying to sound sure. "Don't start freaking everyone out." But Evangeline didn't look convinced. She lay back down but kept her eyes on the wall. And that night, as Amara tried to sleep, she heard it too. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was slow, deliberate, like something was testing the wood from the outside. The next day was filled with swimming, canoeing, and lessons on survival skills. By the time night fell, most of the campers were ready to collapse into their bunks, but not Elias. "All right," he said, standing on the steps of cabin 3. "Who's brave enough to follow me into the woods?" The others laughed nervously. They knew the rules. Stay on the trails. Do not enter the unmarked woods. Miss Eliza's warning had been clear, but rules meant nothing to Elias. He pulled a flashlight from his pocket and waved it like a sword. "I'm serious," he grinned. $10 says I can get to the old fire tower and back in 30 minutes. "You're an idiot," Amara said. "You'll get lost." "Then come with me, brave leader," Elias teased. "No thanks." "Coward," he said, giving her a mock salute before turning toward the tree line. "Time me!" "Don't do it, man," Gideon muttered, watching him with those sharp eyes. "Don't." But Elias just laughed, his flashlight flicking on, and he disappeared into the foggy woods. 30 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. By the time an hour and a half had gone by, Amara was pacing. "He's messing with us," she said, her eyes darting toward the woods. "He's trying to scare us." "No," Evangeline whispered. Her voice was distant, like she wasn't quite there. "He's not laughing anymore." "Stop it!" Amara snapped. But Gideon just stood there, eyes locked on the woods. "He's not coming back," he said softly. Amara shook her head. "No, he's just being stupid." "Look," Gideon pointed. "Look at the fog." It was moving, slowly, creeping out from the tree line. The campers watched as it slithered toward them, curling low to the ground, pale gray and unnervingly thick. "Fog doesn't move like that," Amara whispered. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed from the trees. It wasn't close, it wasn't far, just there. Evangeline gasped, clutching her chest. Her eyes were wild now. "Don't answer," she hissed, her voice sharp as glass. "Don't answer it." "What are you talking about?" Amara asked. "Don't call his name," Evangeline said, her voice breaking. "It's not him anymore." Miss Eliza led a search party the next morning. They scoured the woods, calling Elias's name until their voices cracked. The campers stayed behind, most of them too shaken to speak. They found nothing, not a single footprint. That night, the fog returned. It seeped through the camp so thick it muffled the sound of their footsteps. And that's when the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap on the side of the cabin wall. Amara didn't move. Her heart thudded so loud she swore it would give her away. Tap, tap, tap. "Don't answer it," Evangeline whispered from her bunk, voice hollow with fear. The fog pressed against the window. Shadows moved within it. "Amara?" A voice came from outside. It was Elias's voice. "Let me in." Her blood went cold, because Elias never called her by her first name. "Amara, let me in." The voice echoed softly through the fog, muffled but clear enough to recognize. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came from just beyond the window. "Amara?" It was his voice. It was Elias's voice. Her whole body went rigid. Her eyes darted to Evangeline, whose face was a mask of terror. Evangeline shook her head slowly, her lips barely moving as she mouthed the words, "That's not him." Amara's hands gripped the thin blanket on her bunk. Her eyes flicked to the window. The fog outside was dense, pressing against the glass, swirling like it had something alive inside it. She could just barely make out the shape of a figure standing still, not moving, not breathing, just watching. "Come on," the voice called again, this time more insistent. "It's me, Elias, it's cold out here." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice had that familiar, playful edge. But something was wrong. Elias never called her by her first name. He always called her boss or leader in that half-mocking, half-respectful tone. Never Amara. Her heart thudded in her chest. "Don't answer it. Don't answer it." Then the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap. 3 sharp taps against the glass. Her breath stopped. Her hands pressed to her ears. Her whole body screamed to stay quiet, to stay small. Amara. The voice was right next to the window now, soft, but so close she could feel it in her bones. "It's cold. Let me in." Her heart pounded against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to stop. "Go away, go away, go away." The fog moved. Slowly, it pulled back from the window. The shape outside didn't move. It stood there, still, watching. She didn't sleep that night. None of them did. The next morning, 2 campers were gone. Ruby and Dahlia. Their bunks were empty, their blankets neatly folded, as if they'd simply gotten up early and wandered off. Miss Eliza gathered everyone at the flagpole, her face tight with worry. Her eyes scanned the group like she was counting them again and again to be sure. "We have 2 missing campers," she said, her voice sharp as a bark. "Ruby and Dahlia. If anyone saw them leave, you need to tell me now." The group was silent, heads down. Gideon's eyes stayed on the woods, his jaw tight. Evangeline hugged herself, rocking back and forth. Amara felt that now familiar buzz of dread in her chest. "They didn't leave," Evangeline whispered, just loud enough for Amara to hear. Amara glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Evangeline blinked slowly, her gaze distant. Her fingers drummed on her arm in slow, rhythmic taps. "They didn't leave," she repeated. "They were taken." By noon, search parties had been sent out. Miss Eliza and 2 counselors hiked down the trail that led to the lake. Amara, Gideon, and Evangeline stayed behind with the rest of the campers. None of them spoke, not until Gideon finally said, "You think Ruby and Dahlia are still here?" Amara glanced at him. "What are you talking about?" "I mean," Gideon turned his head toward the woods, eyes narrowed. "Do you think they're still them?" Evangeline's breath hitched. She turned away, hands over her ears. She didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe it. Amara shook her head. "You're both being ridiculous." "Are we?" Gideon said, his gaze steady. "Elias came back, didn't he?" "Don't." Amara's voice was sharp now, too sharp. "Don't say that." "Fine," Gideon muttered, his eyes still on the woods. "But if I hear tapping tonight, I'm not opening the door." That night, the scratches came back. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Amara shot up in her bunk, her breath coming fast. She glanced at Evangeline, who was already awake, sitting up with her knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes flicked toward the window. The scratches didn't stop. Long, slow, deliberate. 3 sharp scrapes, then a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from the wall. Amara felt her heart thump in her throat. "It's just a tree branch," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "No, it's not," Evangeline muttered. She was staring at the wall, her eyes wide, unblinking. "It's not a tree." The scratches stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was silence. Amara let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over. Just an animal, just an animal. Then it came again, but closer this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was lower now, closer to the floor. Amara swung her legs off the bunk, her eyes glued to the spot where the noise had come from. Her foot hit the cold wooden floor. She crouched down slowly and leaned in close to the wall. Her fingers hovered just an inch away from it. "Don't!" Evangeline hissed, but it was too late. Amara pressed her palm flat against the wood. She felt it, a heartbeat. A steady, slow thump, 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 pulsing from the other side of the wall. Her breath caught in her chest. Her fingers twitched, about to pull away, when something pressed back. Something pressed back. Her scream ripped through the cabin like a lightning strike. She scrambled away from the wall, her heart in her throat. The other girls woke up, yelling and shouting, asking what happened, but Amara didn't answer. She didn't stop shaking until the sun came up. They didn't sleep the next night, none of them did. Everyone sat in the main hall, wide-eyed and jumpy. Miss Eliza stayed with them, her hands clutching a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The fog had rolled in again, thicker than ever. It pressed against the windows, muting every sound beyond the camp. No birds, no crickets, just the quiet pressure of something waiting. Evangeline sat beside Amara, her hands still tapping out that strange, slow rhythm on her arm. 3 taps, she muttered, over and over. 3 scratches, 3 missing. "Don't," Amara muttered, her voice hoarse. "Don't start that." "It's calling them," Evangeline whispered. Her eyes locked on Amara, wild and desperate. It called Elias, it called Ruby and Dahlia. She leaned in closer, her breath cold against Amara's ear. "It's going to call you next." Amara shoved her back, heart racing. "Shut up, Evangeline!" But Gideon was staring at her now, not at Evangeline, at her. And then the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. All of them froze. Miss Eliza's coffee cup shattered on the floor. Her face went pale. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed from the window, slow, patient, unhurried. "Don't answer it," Evangeline whispered, tears in her eyes. "Don't answer it. Don't answer it." Then the voice came. "Amara," it said softly, "it's me." Her blood went cold. She knew that voice. It wasn't Elias, it was her own voice. "Amara, it's me." The voice was soft, calm, and perfectly clear. It was her own voice. Amara's breath hitched in her throat. Her pulse drummed so hard in her ears that for a moment she thought she might pass out. Her muscles locked, her eyes glued to the fog-choked window. Her voice, her own voice, called to her again. "Amara, it's okay. Come outside. I need to talk to you." Her hands shook so hard she had to ball them into fists to keep them steady. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stay still, to not answer, to not breathe too loud. Her eyes flicked to Evangeline, who sat rigid, hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Don't," Evangeline mouthed. The tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap perfectly spaced, like a metronome counting down. Miss Eliza stood slowly, eyes locked on the window. Her breathing was shallow, like she was trying not to be heard. Her gaze shifted to Amara. No words, just a subtle shake of her head. But it wasn't subtle enough. The tapping stopped. For a second, everything went still. So still it felt like the air had gone solid, pressing down on their lungs. Then a knock, not a tap, not a scratch. A knock, 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 knock. Heavy, purposeful, and right at the front door of the cabin. Miss Eliza's eyes shot to the door, her face a mask of quiet terror. Slowly, she raised a finger to her lips, a universal signal for silence. She mouthed, "Don't move." The knock came again, knock, 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 3 knocks, just like the scratches, just like the taps. "Amara," the voice came again, but this time from the door. "Please, I'm scared, I'm outside, I need you." Her stomach turned. It was still her voice, but now it was begging. Her own voice, but cracked, frantic, like someone on the edge of tears. She covered her ears, pressing them hard against her skull, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. No one slept. They sat in silence until the fog finally pulled back at dawn. The sun burned through it slowly, like a knife cutting through flesh. When it was gone, Miss Eliza stood up, her face hard as stone. "Get dressed," she said. "We're leaving." Her tone was sharp, commanding. She didn't have to explain. None of them argued. Amara grabbed her bag, heart pounding with every movement. Her fingers shook as she stuffed her clothes into her backpack. "This is it. We're leaving. We're leaving." But something gnawed at her, a terrible realization that sank in as she packed. 2 people were still missing, Ruby and Dahlia. Miss Eliza was already at the door, yelling at the other campers to pack fast. Gideon stuffed his clothes into his bag with calm efficiency, but his eyes kept flicking to the windows. Evangeline sat on her bed, unmoving, her eyes hollow. Amara knelt beside her. "Hey, Evangeline, we're leaving." "Too late," Evangeline muttered. "What?" Evangeline slowly turned her head toward her, her eyes wet with tears. "It doesn't let you leave," she whispered. "Not after it scratches you." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "No," she said, forcing herself to smile. "No, we're leaving. Miss Eliza's getting us out of here." But Evangeline didn't answer. She just stared at the window. Amara followed her gaze. There on the glass was a fresh mark. 3 long, jagged scratches gouged into the pane from the inside. Amara's heart stopped. She hadn't heard it happen. No one had. "Amara," Evangeline said, her voice small. "You didn't hear it, did you?" Amara's breath came in short, sharp gasps. "No." "Then it's already inside," Evangeline said. Miss Eliza made one final announcement. "We're doing one more sweep of the woods for Ruby and Dahlia before we leave," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I need volunteers." The campers glanced at one another. No one wanted to go into those woods. Not after the scratches, not after the tapping, not after that voice. "I'll go," Gideon said quietly. Amara turned to him, eyes wide. "Gideon, no, don't be stupid." He glanced at her, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "We can't leave them behind, Amara." She clenched her jaw. Her mind screamed at her to stay, but something in her heart twisted. She couldn't stand the idea of Ruby and Dahlia lost in those woods, alone. "I'm coming too," she said before she could stop herself. "Me too," Evangeline whispered. "No," Amara said firmly. "Stay here, Evangeline." Evangeline's gaze didn't break. "It's already inside, Amara. I'm safer with you." Miss Eliza nodded at them, her face grim. "Fine, but stay close. If you see fog, we turn back immediately." The woods swallowed them. They moved in silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. Every branch, every crack of a twig felt like a warning. "Ruby! Dahlia!" Miss Eliza called, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. No answer. Amara glanced over her shoulder at Evangeline, who was walking slower than the rest. Her head was tilted, like she was listening to something the others couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" Evangeline asked softly. "No," Amara said quickly. "I do," Gideon muttered, eyes flicking to the side. "Like breathing." Amara stopped walking. She strained her ears. There was nothing, until there was. A long, slow exhale, like someone breathing out just behind her ear. Her head whipped around, heart racing. No one was there, but that didn't matter, did it? She could feel it. She could feel something watching them. "I see the fire tower," Miss Eliza said, pointing ahead. Her voice was tight, strained. "Come on." The old fire tower rose above the trees like a skeletal hand clawing at the sky. Rusted steps zigzagged up its frame, and as they approached, Amara felt her legs weaken. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. "You hear that?" Gideon said suddenly, his voice a sharp whisper. Amara froze, her ears strained. Tap, tap. Tap, it echoed from above, from the top of the fire tower. Evangeline whimpered, "It's up there." The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. "I'm going up," Miss Eliza said. Her voice was firm, but her eyes were full of fear. She climbed the steps slowly, each creak of metal echoing like a scream. Amara and Gideon followed, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting up the stairs. The tapping didn't stop. When they reached the top, Amara's heart stopped. Ruby and Dahlia were there, their eyes wide, their faces pale. They were standing perfectly still, faces blank, mouths slightly open. "Ruby!" Miss Eliza's voice shook. "Dahlia!" They didn't move. Then, in perfect unison, they tilted their heads at the exact same angle, slowly, deliberately. They smiled. Their lips moved together, speaking as one. "It's cold out here. It's cold out here." The words spilled from Ruby and Dahlia's mouths in perfect unison, like puppets being played by the same hand. Their eyes didn't blink. Their smiles didn't falter. Miss Eliza froze at the top of the fire tower, one hand gripping the rusty railing, her knuckles white as chalk. "Ruby," she called softly. Her voice was strained, too cautious, like she knew she shouldn't have said anything at all. "Dahlia?" Neither girl responded. They just kept smiling, their heads tilted at identical angles, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. "Something's wrong," Gideon whispered, taking a slow step back. His breathing was shallow, his eyes locked on the girls. "They're not blinking." Amara's hands trembled as she moved closer to Miss Eliza. "Ruby, Dahlia," she called, her voice cracking with hope she didn't believe in. The girls tilted their heads in the other direction, slowly, unnaturally. The movement was too smooth, too perfect, like bones bending without joints. Then, at the same moment, they opened their mouths, not to speak, to scream. The sound wasn't human. It was a sharp, piercing, metallic wail that shot straight through Amara's skull. She clapped her hands over her ears, teeth gritted as the sound vibrated inside her bones. Gideon fell to one knee, gasping in pain, eyes squeezed shut. Miss Eliza stumbled back, gripping the railing to keep from falling. The sound didn't stop. "Get down!" Miss Eliza shouted, her voice barely cutting through the noise. "Everyone, get down the tower." Gideon didn't hesitate. He half ran, half fell down the creaking metal stairs. Amara followed, heart racing so hard she could barely breathe. She kept her eyes on Gideon's back, too terrified to glance behind her. But as they reached the bottom, she made one mistake. She glanced up. Ruby and Dahlia were leaning over the edge of the platform, faces upside down like spiders hanging from a web. Their eyes were black holes, no whites, no pupils, just endless pits of darkness. And still, they smiled. Amara hit the ground and stumbled back, breath hitching in her chest. Gideon grabbed her by the arm and yanked her toward the path. "Run!" he shouted. "Don't stop!" Miss Eliza was behind them, running full speed. Her eyes darted from side to side, as if expecting something to leap from the fog at any moment. The fog was thicker now, curling around their feet, muffling the crunch of dead leaves beneath them. But it didn't muffle the sound of footsteps. Tap, tap, tap. They were behind them. Soft, unhurried footsteps, not running, following. "Don't look back," Miss Eliza barked. "Don't stop, don't slow down, and don't look back." Amara didn't, but she felt it. She felt them behind her, closer now, closer than before. Her eyes watered from the cold air whipping against her face. She stumbled but didn't fall. Gideon grabbed her arm again, pulling her forward. Tap, tap, tap. 3 footsteps, then a pause. Tap, tap, tap. Another pause. The rhythm was deliberate, mocking. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed for rest, but she ran. She ran until she saw the edge of the clearing ahead, where the cabins lay like old bones scattered on the earth. "Almost there," Gideon gasped. Then the fog moved, not drifted, not floated, moved. Thick tendrils of grey fog surged toward them like snakes, curling around their ankles. Amara yelped as the cold clutched her legs, dragging her to a stop. She kicked and thrashed, trying to break free. "No, no, no, no!" she screamed. Gideon spun around, his eyes wild. "Hold on!" He gripped her arms and pulled. She felt something pull back. It wasn't fog. It was solid. Cold fingers, long, wet fingers. Miss Eliza's face twisted in rage as she stomped over. "Let her go!" she roared, kicking at the fog with her boots. It shrank back for a moment, releasing its grip on Amara's legs. She scrambled up, gasping for air, tears streaking down her face. "Run!" Miss Eliza said, her eyes locked on the fog. "Run now!" They ran. They didn't look back. That night, the fog didn't leave. It hung around the cabins like it was waiting. The other campers whispered, their eyes flicking toward the windows every few seconds. No one asked about Ruby or Dahlia. No one asked about Elias. They all knew better now. Amara sat on her bunk, arms wrapped around her knees. She hadn't said a word since the fire tower. Evangeline sat beside her eyes locked on the window. Her fingers tapped against her thigh in a slow, steady rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, another pause. Amara watched her, heart thudding in her chest. "What are you doing?" Evangeline didn't look at her. Her eyes were distant, her lips moving silently as if counting something. "Evangeline," Amara said more firmly, reaching out to grab her hand. "What are you doing?" Evangeline blinked, like waking from a dream. Her eyes shifted slowly toward Amara, unfocused. "It's learning," she said softly. Amara's breath froze in her lungs. "What?" "It's learning our rhythm," Evangeline whispered. Her eyes darted to the window, pupils dilated like a frightened animal. "The taps, the scratches, 3 at a time, over and over." She turned her head slowly toward Amara, and something about her face was wrong. Her eyes didn't blink. Her smile was too wide. "It's counting us." Amara's heart felt like it stopped. "It took Elias," Evangeline whispered. Her eyes didn't blink. They didn't blink. Then Ruby, then Dahlia. "It's counting down, 3 at a time." "Shut up," Amara said, voice trembling. "Shut up, Evangeline." But Evangeline kept smiling. Her head tilted slowly, like Ruby and Dahlia had done at the tower. Her smile widened too far, the corners of her mouth stretching past her cheeks. Her breath came out slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. "Don't you hear it, Amara?" she said softly, her voice too calm. "It's almost your turn." Her head tilted the other way, bones cracking quietly. The light in the cabin flickered. Amara's eyes darted to the window, her breath caught in her throat. The fog was pressing against the glass again. Something moved inside it, not fast, not sudden, but slow, patient. It pressed against the window close enough that she could make out the faint outline of a face just like hers. Its lips moved. "Amara," it whispered in her own voice, "let me in." No one left their cabins that night. The fog was heavier than ever, curling up from the ground like it was alive. It pressed against the doors, seeped through the cracks in the walls, and filled the air with that smell of damp wood and copper. Every breath tasted old, rotten. Miss Eliza didn't leave her cabin either. Nobody saw her since she told them to stay inside. "Is she still out there?" Gideon asked, his face pale in the dim light. His hands were jammed into his jacket pockets, his eyes darting between the window and the door. "Maybe," Amara said quietly, though she didn't believe it. No one had seen Miss Eliza after they got back from the fire tower. "Something's wrong," Evangeline whispered. She sat cross-legged on her bed, her eyes locked on the door. "She wouldn't leave us like this." Her fingers tapped her thigh. Tap, tap, tap. "Stop doing that," Gideon muttered, not looking at her. Evangeline didn't stop. The air inside the cabin felt tight, like it had been squeezed out of the room. No one spoke for a long time, just the sound of tapping. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Tap, tap, tap. "Evangeline, I swear, if you don't, it's not me this time." Her voice was hollow, empty. They all froze. Amara turned toward the window, heart racing so fast she thought it might stop. The tapping didn't come from Evangeline's hand. It was coming from outside, tap, tap, tap. It echoed from the far side of the wall, just beneath the window. The sound wasn't frantic or hurried. It was slow, patient. Gideon's face twisted with fear. He backed away from the window like it might shatter at any moment. "No," Amara whispered. "No, no, no." "Don't answer it," Evangeline muttered, rocking back and forth. Her eyes didn't blink. "Don't answer it. Don't answer it. Don't answer it." Her voice grew louder with every repetition until it was like a chant, breathy and desperate. Then the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. They sat there, straining to hear anything. No tapping, no footsteps, no fog brushing against the windows. Just silence. Amara's breath hitched, her heart thudded in her chest like a drum. Slowly, she got up, her legs stiff as wood. Her eyes stayed on the window as she walked toward the wall. "Don't do it," Gideon hissed, but she had to know. Her breath fogged up the glass as she leaned in close. Her eyes scanned the fog outside, searching for movement, for shapes, for a face right there, inches away. It wasn't her face this time. It wasn't Elias either. It was Ruby. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her smile too sharp, too wide for her face. Her lips didn't move, but Amara could hear her voice. "It's cold out here." Amara's scream hit the cabin like thunder. She stumbled backward, eyes wild, crashing into the bunk behind her. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, eyes darting toward the window, but by the time he looked, the face was gone. "Did you see it?" Amara gasped, her voice trembling. "Did you see it?" Gideon nodded slowly. His face was pale as paper. "Ruby," he said, barely above a whisper. "Her eyes," Evangeline muttered, still staring at the window. "Did you see her eyes?" Amara shook her head. She didn't want to think about it. Her pulse still pounded in her ears and her body felt cold, colder than it should have been. Then Evangeline said something that made her skin crawl. "They weren't looking at us," she said softly, eyes distant. "She was looking at you." The next morning, Gideon was gone. His bed was still made, his shoes were still by the door, but Gideon wasn't there. Amara felt something twist in her chest when she saw it. Not panic, not surprise, just a terrible, quiet understanding. "It got him," Evangeline said, sitting on her bunk with her knees pulled to her chest. Her voice was empty, like she was already miles away. "It scratched him." "No," Amara muttered, pacing the cabin. "No, he wouldn't leave like that." Her hands tugged at her hair, her eyes darted from the window to the door to the bunks. She checked under the beds, checked the closets, checked the bathroom twice. Nothing. No sign of him at all. Evangeline's voice came soft from behind her. 3 scratches. Amara turned, her breath shaky. "What?" Evangeline's head tilted slowly, her face blank, her eyes locked on Amara's arms. Amara followed her gaze. Her breath stopped. 3 faint red lines ran down her forearm, thin, fresh, like she'd brushed against something sharp. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She rubbed at them, thinking it was just dirt or a scratch from the old bunk beds, but the marks didn't fade. 3 scratches, Evangeline repeated. Her voice was a hollow echo now. 3 taps, 3 missing. It's counting down. "Stop it," Amara hissed, her voice cracking. "Just shut up, okay? Shut up." But Evangeline didn't stop. She just smiled, slow and wide, her head tilted at that wrong, awful angle. "You're next," she whispered. Amara backed away from her, her hands still rubbing at her arm like she could wipe away the marks. She could hear her own breathing, fast and shallow. "Not me. It's not me. It's not me." But it didn't matter what she believed, did it? The scratches didn't lie. The fog was thicker that night than it had ever been. It was like breathing through a wet rag. Amara could barely see her own hand in front of her face. The glow of the camp lanterns was swallowed whole by the fog, turning everything into a dim, ghostly grey. She sat in the center of the cabin, her back to the wall. Evangeline sat across from her, eyes wide, unblinking. She was rocking back and forth slowly, tapping her fingers on her knee. Tap, tap, tap. "Stop it," Amara muttered, hugging her knees. "It's almost done," Evangeline said softly. Her eyes locked on Amara's arm. "One more." "Stop talking like that," Amara snapped, eyes wild. "You sound just like it." But Evangeline didn't stop. "You know it's true," she said, still rocking. "One more scratch. One more tap." She tilted her head slowly, her voice low and sweet like a lullaby. "Then it's over." Amara pressed her hands against her ears, tears running down her face. Her chest felt tight. Her eyes darted around the room. "No, no, no, I'm not next. I'm not next." Her gaze flicked to the window. The fog pressed against the glass. A shape moved inside it, slow, patient. Her heart stopped. She crawled back against the wall, tears streaking her face. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't open them, don't open them, don't open them." A single knock echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Her name came softly from the window. "Amara," it whispered. "It's me. Let me in." Her breath stopped, because this time it wasn't her voice. It was Gideon's. "Amara, it's me. Let me in." Her whole body froze. That was Gideon's voice. His exact tone, the way he dragged out the last syllable of her name, just like he used to do when he wanted to get under her skin. It was him. It had to be him. But she knew it wasn't. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Her hands pressed tightly to her ears, eyes squeezed shut so hard that sparks of white light danced in the darkness. "Go away," she whispered through gritted teeth. "You're not him." The fog brushed against the window like fingertips dragging along the glass. Tap, tap, tap. "Don't do this, Amara," the voice said softly. "It's me. I'm cold." Her breath hitched, chest heaving, as she struggled to keep herself from screaming. "Don't open your eyes. Don't answer. Don't move. Tap, tap, tap." "Please," it said, and this time his voice cracked like he was about to cry. "Please, Amara, I'm so cold out here." Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and doubt. What if it really is him, she thought. What if he's hurt? Her fingers twitched toward the window latch. "No!" Evangeline's voice cut through the fog like a blade. Amara's head jerked up, eyes snapping open. Evangeline was staring at her, eyes wide with fear. Her lips trembled as she shook her head violently. "It's not him," Evangeline whispered, her face pale as death. "It's never them." Amara yanked her hands back from the window. Her chest heaved as if she'd just sprinted a mile. Her whole body shook with adrenaline. She glanced at Evangeline, her heart still hammering in her chest. Evangeline tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you believe me now?" she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. Amara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The tapping stopped. For the first time, there was no knock, no scratch, no tap. There was only the sound of breathing. It was slow and deep, and it wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It came from outside the window, as steady as ocean waves crashing against the shore. Breathe in, breathe out. Long, slow, measured. Amara's throat tightened as she clutched her knees. She didn't know how long it went on. Minutes, hours. It didn't matter. She never stopped listening. Because she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't breathing for itself. It was breathing for her. At dawn, they finally opened the cabin door. The fog was still there, thick as ever, but it wasn't pressing against the windows anymore. It hung low to the ground, barely swirling as if waiting for something. The other campers stumbled out of their cabins, tired, eyes wide with sleepless fear. No one spoke. No one asked about Gideon. They all knew. They all knew. "Miss Eliza," someone muttered. "Where is Miss Eliza?" "She's gone," said one of the boys from cabin 2. His name was Logan, and his eyes darted around like he expected to be grabbed at any moment. "I checked her cabin. She's not there." Evangeline turned slowly to Amara. Her eyes were distant, her voice hollow. "Do you understand it now?" she asked softly. Amara swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her voice barely a whisper. "Understand what?" "The counting," Evangeline said, tilting her head just a little too far. Her eyes didn't blink. "It started with Elias, then Ruby and Dahlia, then Gideon, 3 at a time. Always 3. Amara's breath caught in her chest. "Stop," she muttered, taking a step back. "Just stop, Evangeline." But Evangeline didn't stop. Her voice grew softer. She leaned in close. 3 scratches, 3 taps, 3 gone, she whispered. Her eyes met Amara's, and for a moment they didn't look like her eyes at all. "It needs 3 more." Amara's heart thudded in her chest. Her eyes darted around the camp. Logan, Dahlia, the other campers. It was counting. It had always been counting, 3 at a time. Her breathing grew rapid, her head darting around as if she could see it, as if she could spot it, hiding in the fog. "Amara?" Evangeline's voice was soft. She reached out to touch her arm. Her fingers were ice cold. Amara flinched. "Don't touch me!" "Don't you see?" Evangeline's smile was too wide, her lips trembling like she was holding back a laugh. "You're next, Amara." The fog didn't wait that night. By sundown it was already there, thick, suffocating, and wrong. It didn't feel like mist or vapor. It felt like something alive. It clung to their skin, their clothes, their hair. Every breath tasted like dirt and metal. The campers sat in cabin 8, backs pressed against the wall, eyes darting to the windows. "Does anyone have a phone?" Logan asked, his voice shaking. "No service," Amara muttered, her voice dry as dead leaves. "There's never been service." "Then what do we do?" one of the younger campers asked, his voice cracking with fear. His name was Mason. He couldn't have been older than 12. His face was pale, his eyes locked on the window. "Nobody leaves," Amara said, her eyes flicking to each of them in turn. "Nobody." "What about Miss Eliza?" Logan asked. Amara hesitated. "She's gone," she said quietly, "like the others." Logan shook his head, face twisted in disbelief. No, she's not like them. She's not like them." "Logan," Amara snapped, her voice sharp. "Look at me." He looked at her, eyes full of panic. "You want to stay alive," she said, her face hard as stone. "Then don't open the door, don't open the window, don't answer the tapping. Do you understand me?" He nodded quickly, his breathing fast. "Do you understand me?" she said again, louder this time. Yes," Logan stammered. "Good," Amara said. Her eyes flicked to Evangeline, sitting quietly in the corner. Her head was tilted again, fingers tapping on her leg. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flicked to Amara. Her smile was slow. 3 more, she whispered. Amara felt her blood run cold. That was the moment the knocking started. Knock, knock, knock. Everyone's head shot to the door. The knocks were loud, heavy, not taps, not scratches, knocks. "Don't answer it," Amara whispered, her heart in her throat. The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. Her name came next, soft, familiar. "Amara?" It was Gideon's voice again, just like before. "Please, it's me. I'm back. Let me in." Her chest heaved. Her eyes darted to the door. Her hands twitched. "Amara," the voice said, calm and kind. "Come on, boss." "It's me." Her fingers hovered over the door latch. "Don't answer it." Evangeline's voice was a scream. "It's not him." But Gideon's voice spoke again, low and familiar, so close it could have been inside her ear. "Please, Amara, it's so cold out here." "Please, Amara, it's so cold out here." Her breath felt trapped in her chest. The voice was too familiar, too real. It had the exact rhythm, the exact softness that Gideon always had when he was serious. Her fingers hovered over the latch of the door. "Don't!" Evangeline hissed, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't! Open it!" Amara's eyes darted to her. Evangeline's head was tilted, her pupils like pinpricks. Her hands were pressed flat against her ears, her lips moving silently. "It's not him," Evangeline whispered, rocking slowly. "It's not him, it's not him, it's not him." The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. "Amara!" The voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was patient, calm. "Don't listen to her. She's scared. She's always been scared. You're not scared, though. You're brave." Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It sounds just like him. It sounds just like him." Her fingers brushed the cold metal latch. "Now don't open it!" Evangeline's scream was shrill now, frantic, desperate. "If you open it, you won't be you anymore." Amara's hand froze. "You won't be you anymore." Her eyes flicked to the window. The fog swirled against the glass, pale grey tendrils curling and twisting like smoke in water. Shadows moved within it, not one, not two, three. She stumbled back from the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her chest ached, her legs felt weak. "It's counting down." Evangeline's words echoed in her head. 3 scratches, 3 taps, 3 missing, 3 more. Her gaze shot to the other campers. Mason was sitting by the wall, eyes darting to every shadow, his face pale as death. Logan was gripping a flashlight like it was a sword, his lips moving in a silent prayer. And then there was Evangeline, rocking, 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 her head tilted at that unnatural angle. 3. Amara's hands flew to her arms. Her fingers traced her skin, desperate to feel for something. Her heart stopped. 3 red scratches. The next few hours passed in an uneasy blur. No one spoke. No one moved. The fog stayed where it was, blanketing the camp with a silent, choking pressure. Amara sat with her back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door. The others sat near her, their eyes darting to the window every few seconds. No one mentioned Gideon. No one mentioned Ruby or Dahlia or Elias. They were all thinking the same thing. Who's next? The silence was suffocating. The weight of it pressed down on them all, making every creak of the floor and every shift of the fog feel like thunder. Mason sniffled softly, his breath hitching as he tried to hold in his tears. "Stay awake," Amara muttered, glancing at him. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't spoken in days. "Don't sleep, don't close your eyes." Mason nodded, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "I'm not sleeping," he whispered, his eyes wide as saucers. Logan was pacing now. His footsteps were soft but constant, like he needed to keep moving to stay sane. He glanced at the door every few steps, then at the window. His breathing was shallow, too fast. "They're coming," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting from side to side. "They're coming, they're coming, they're coming." Amara shot him a look. "Stop it, Logan." He didn't. He just kept pacing, faster now, faster and faster. "I'm not waiting here," he muttered. His voice was shaky. "I'm not waiting for it to pick me." "Logan," Amara said, her voice sharp, "don't you dare." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild now, his breath shallow. "If I keep moving, it can't catch me," he muttered, his fingers twitching. "If I keep moving, it can't count me. It can't count me if I'm moving." "Logan," Amara said, standing up slowly. Her hands were up like she was approaching a wild animal. "Listen to me. You have to stay here." "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "No, no, no, no." His eyes locked on the door, his whole body tensed. "No, no, 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 don't do it. Logan, please." He ran for the door. "Logan, stop!" Amara screamed, lunging for him, but she wasn't fast enough. His hands hit the latch. He threw the door open wide. Fog poured inside like a flood. It wasn't slow this time. It rushed in, curling around his legs and arms. Logan's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a scream, but no sound came out. His face twisted in horror as he stumbled back, clawing at his chest. "Logan!" Amara screamed, grabbing his arm. She pulled with everything she had, but something on the other side was pulling harder. "Please!" Logan's voice cracked as he fought against the pull, his eyes locked on hers. His eyes were wild with terror. "Don't let me go!" "I'm not," Amara sobbed, her hands aching from how tightly she gripped him. "I'm not letting you go!" But the fog was stronger. His body jerked suddenly, yanked with such force that her fingers slipped. She hit the ground hard, her head slamming against the wood, her vision blurred with stars. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was Logan's face, his eyes locked on hers as the fog pulled him backward. His lips moved. She didn't hear the words, but she knew what he said. "It's so cold." Then he was gone. The fog pulled him into the woods. The door slammed shut. Amara woke to the sound of crying. Her head throbbed, and her vision was blurred from the pain. Her hands ached, her fingers stiff like she'd been gripping something too tightly. "Amara," Mason sobbed, his voice small and broken. "He's gone." She sat up slowly, her heart pounding like a drum. The room spun for a moment before settling. Evangeline sat in the corner, rocking. Her eyes were on the floor. Her lips moved slowly, repeating something over and over. "3 more," she whispered. "3 more, 3 more, 3 more." Amara crawled toward her, every movement a struggle. Her eyes burned with tears. "Evangeline," she croaked, "please, please stop." Evangeline's head tilted slowly toward her. Her eyes met Amara's. Her pupils were gone, just black pits. "It's almost done," Evangeline said in a voice that was no longer hers. It was layered, deep and hollow, like a voice coming from the bottom of a well. Amara backed away. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Evangeline's mouth twisted into a smile that split her face far too wide. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, bones cracking as she leaned forward. Tap, tap, tap. Her fingers drummed on her knee, slow and steady. Her eyes stayed on Amara. Her lips parted, her voice soft and sweet like a lullaby. "It's counting down, Amara." Her head tilted so far it nearly touched her shoulder. Her eyes didn't blink. Her fingers tapped 3 more times. 1 more left. 1 more left. Evangeline's words echoed in Amara's ears like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scrambled back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. Evangeline didn't look like herself anymore. Her head tilted at a grotesque angle, her smile stretched too far across her face, and Evangeline... Amara's voice was barely a whisper, her throat dry and tight. But Evangeline didn't answer. Her fingers tapped on her knee. Tap, tap, tap. "Stop it," Amara said, her voice sharper now. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her hands gripped the cold wooden floor as if she could anchor herself to it. "Stop it, Evangeline." Her smile widened. Crack. Her head tilted a little further to the side, her neck bending at a sickening angle that no human neck should ever bend. "You can hear it now, can't you?" Evangeline's voice was layered, like more than one voice was speaking at once. One was hers, the other was something deeper, something that didn't belong in this world. "Shut up," Amara hissed, squeezing her hands over her ears. "Just shut up!" But she could still hear it, that soft, steady tapping, tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from Evangeline, it was coming from the door. Her head snapped toward it, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. 3 knocks echoed through the cabin, loud and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. "Amara!" A voice called from the other side, a familiar voice, her voice. Her chest tightened, her fingers trembling. Her whole body froze as she stared at the door. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. "Amara," the voice said again, calm, kind, patient. "It's okay. I'm here now. I can help you." Her voice, her own voice. "No," Amara whispered. Her voice cracked like broken glass. "No, you're not me. You're not me." "Knock, knock, knock. Let me in," the voice said. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Her eyes flicked to Evangeline, who was still tapping. Tap, tap, tap. "It's here," Evangeline whispered, her eyes locked on the door. Her smile vanished. Her voice dropped to a low, hollow tone. "It's been waiting for you, Amara." Her gaze snapped to Amara. Her eyes widened with wild intensity, her voice dropping to a rasp. "Don't open it." The knock stopped. Silence fell like a thick blanket over the cabin. Even the fog outside seemed to pause. No movement, no sound. But then, softly, quietly, something new began. A sound like nails dragging across wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her mind splintered. She could feel it. The scratches weren't fast. They weren't frantic. They were slow, deliberate. Amara hugged her knees, shaking her head, rocking herself back and forth like Evangeline had done. She clutched at her arms, feeling the 3 faint scratches on her forearm, the ones that hadn't stopped burning since she noticed them. "It's counting down." "Don't answer it," Evangeline whispered. Her voice was a low rasp, a threadbare echo of what it used to be. "Don't look at it. Don't listen to it. It's trying to finish. Scratch, scratch, scratch." Her heart thudded so hard it felt like it might break her ribs. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She clenched her hands into fists, digging her nails into her palms to ground herself. Then she felt it. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart stopped for just a moment. A pressure, a cold, steady pressure on her forearm. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't painful, but it was there. A dragging sensation, slow and purposeful. Her eyes darted down to her arm. Her heart went still. Another scratch. A 4th line, fresh and red, slowly carving itself into her skin, as if an invisible hand were writing it in blood. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, no, no!" She slapped at her arm, wiping at it frantically, trying to rub it away. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her fingers pressed so hard into her skin that she left bruises. But the scratch stayed. One more left. Her chest heaved with ragged sobs. Her hands dug into her hair, pulling at it. Her vision swam as the room around her spun. She felt it in her head. That presence, not a voice, not a thought. Something old. Amara. Her head snapped up. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was inside the room. Her eyes darted to the center of the room, her breath hitching. No one was there. But she felt it, the pressure in the air. The heaviness that pressed down on her shoulders, on her chest, on her mind. "Amara," the voice said again, coming from behind her now. Her whole body tensed. Her blood went cold. Her eyes darted left, then right. Her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Don't turn around," Evangeline's voice whispered, barely audible. "If you look at it, you're done." Amara squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaking down her face. Her breath came in fast, shallow gulps. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." But the voice was right behind her now, so close she could feel its breath on the back of her neck. "Amara," it whispered softly, its breath like ice. "Look at me." Her body shook violently. Her fingers curled into her palms, nails digging into her skin so hard she felt them break the flesh. "Look at me, Amara." Her body twitched, her head tilted, her eyes snapped open. Her head began to turn. "No!" Evangeline screamed, her voice so sharp it cut through the fog in Amara's mind like a knife. "Don't look at it!" Amara stopped. Her body trembled as she forced herself to stop turning. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. The voice didn't like that. The fog around them swirled faster. The cold in the air grew sharper, biting into her skin like needles of ice. The voice was no longer soft. It was loud now, furious. "Look at me!" Her breath caught in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut and screamed. Her fingers clutched at her head as if she could pull the voice out of her skull. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. "Look at me, Amara!" She screamed louder, her voice raw. Then everything stopped. Silence. Cold. Her eyes slowly opened, tears streaking down her face. She was shaking, her body aching with exhaustion. Her gaze shifted slowly to her arm, to the marks she knew she would see. 4 scratches, no, 5. Her chest ached as she stared at them, her mind refusing to understand. She traced her fingers over the 5th line. "Evangeline," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. No response. She turned slowly, her eyes darting around the cabin. "Evangeline," she said louder. The cabin was empty. Her heart stopped. 3 scratches, 3 taps, 3 gone. 3 more. Her breath hitched as realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She was the last one left, and from the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows, something breathed in deeply. Long, slow, patient. "Amara, it's so cold out here." Amara sat in the center of the cabin, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes locked on the door. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. She was alone. Her ears strained for any sound, but the world outside was silent. The fog swirled against the windows, thicker than ever. Every now and then she'd see it shift, like something was moving just out of sight. Her fingers traced the 5 scratches on her arm. Her nails scraped at them, trying to convince herself they weren't real. But they didn't fade. The thin, raw lines burned beneath her skin. 3 scratches, 3 taps. 3 gone. Her own voice echoed in her mind. Her heart thudded in her chest. 3 more, Evangeline had said. Ruby, Dahlia, Elias, Gideon, Logan, Evangeline. Now it's just me. Her throat tightened as panic began to claw its way up from her chest. Her breath hitched, her eyes darted toward the window. The fog pressed against the glass, swirling slowly, steadily. And in that fog, something moved. A figure. Her breath caught in her throat. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She pressed her back harder against the wall. Don't look at it. Don't look too long. But her eyes wouldn't listen. It moved slowly, gliding past the window. Not walking, floating. It didn't turn toward her, but she could feel it looking at her. Her body trembled, her eyes filled with tears. Her nails dug into the flesh of her palms, her mind repeating the same phrase over and over. Don't open the door. Don't answer it. Don't answer it. The fog outside shifted, parting slowly like a curtain being drawn aside. Something stepped into view. Her heart stopped, her throat closed. It was Evangeline, but it wasn't her. Her head tilted at that impossible angle, her eyes gone black as tar, her mouth twisted into that awful too-wide smile. She stared into the cabin through the window, her face pressed so close that the glass fogged with every slow exhale. Breathe in, breathe out. Amara couldn't look away, her body locked up, her fingers frozen in place. Evangeline's eyes didn't blink, her lips didn't move, but somehow she spoke. Her voice wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a shout, it was just there, right behind Amara's ear. It's your turn now. Her whole body jolted like she'd been struck by lightning. She stumbled backward, gasping, her hands flying to her ears. No, no, it's not me. It's not me. But the fog knew better. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes darted toward the window, but Evangeline was gone. The fog had swallowed her whole. The tapping was at the door now. Knock, knock, knock. Her heart was a wild drumbeat in her chest. She stumbled away from the door, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her back hit the far wall, and she slid down, curling into a ball, her arms wrapped around her head. Please, she whispered, tears streaking her face. Please, just leave me alone. The knocking stopped. Her heart thudded in her chest, so loud she thought it would give her away. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with panic. She listened, she waited. No tapping, no knocking, but then she heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her head snapped up, her breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the cabin. Her eyes darted around the room, wild with terror. Her fingers dug into the wood beneath her. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Where?" she whispered. "Where is it?" The scratches moved. They came from the wall to her left, then from the ceiling above, then from behind her. Her breath hitched. She twisted around, eyes darting over the wall. Nothing. The sound shifted again, this time to the bed. Her eyes went to the bunk, and her whole body went cold. Slowly, carefully, she crouched down, peering beneath the bed. Her heart was a wild, frantic drumbeat in her chest. Her hands gripped the edge of the bed frame, fingers trembling. Her eyes strained to see through the darkness beneath the bed. She leaned in just a little closer. Then she saw it. A face, her own face. It grinned at her from the shadows, lips pulled back in a too-wide smile, teeth sharp as needles. Its eyes were black pits, endless and empty. Her scream tore through the cabin. The thing beneath the bed lunged. She scrambled back, her hands clawing at the floor, her feet kicking wildly. Her heart was pounding so fast she thought it would burst. She didn't see where it went. Her eyes darted around the room. She was panting, gasping, tears in her eyes. She twisted around, pressing her back to the wall. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her eyes scanned every corner of the cabin, but she didn't see it. But she felt it. It wasn't under the bed anymore. It was behind her. Her body went cold. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands twitched at her sides. She didn't want to turn. She didn't want to know. Her eyes filled with tears as she clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms so hard that they drew blood. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Then she heard it. A voice, her own voice, right behind her ear. "Look at me, Amara." Her breath stopped. Her eyes widened with pure, raw terror. Her heart felt like it had stopped beating entirely. Her body twitched. Her neck jerked slightly, like her muscles weren't under her control. Her head tilted slowly to the right. "No!" she whispered through gritted teeth. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Her tears ran hot down her face. "No, no, 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 no!" The voice laughed, a low, hollow sound. "Just one more." Her body twitched again, her head tilted further. She squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. "Don't look," she whispered to herself. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." But her head moved anyway. Her eyes opened, her head turned, and there it was, her own face, staring back at her, grinning. "Got you," it whispered, its eyes black as death. Her scream was cut off, her voice strangled in her throat. Her body tensed, frozen in place. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her own face leaning in close, eyes wide with mockery, its grin stretched so far that its skin cracked. Her voice echoed softly in her ears. "It's cold out here." The camp was empty when they found it. Rangers discovered the site 2 weeks later, empty cabins, food left uneaten on plates, no sign of Miss Eliza, no sign of any campers. The fog lingered for days. They searched for weeks but found no tracks, no bodies, just a few things left behind, a cracked flashlight, a backpack with the name Amara stitched into the fabric. And on the inside wall of cabin 8, there were scratches, not animal scratches, not claw marks. 5 clean, perfect scratches carved into the wood. The ranger who found them leaned in close, running his fingers over the marks, his brows furrowed. 5 marks, he muttered. "Why 5? Tap, tap, tap." He turned around. No one was there.